this morning we're shifting from assessment, of course, to the instructional process, the signature pedagogy, perhaps. He's written a lot about that. Let me just kind of at least say good morning to you. Thank you very much for being here. Can we all wave to say hello to him? Lee, it's great that you can talk. I've heard some interest in talking about the signature pedagogy, and I hear that people would like to know a bit more about what are the characteristics of one? How do you know if you've got one in hand? And what role would it play in the various parts of a program? Would a signature pedagogy related to teacher educators be similar or different from one that might work for organizational leaders in education? What's the relationship to core knowledge and other aspects of the program? These are just some questions I've heard that I think people are ready to hear your thoughts and then talk with you about. Thank you very much for meeting so early in the morning. I'm impressed with all the light coming through the window. It's really 7 o'clock in the morning there.
The light you're seeing is not from the window. It's pitch dark out there. This is just the light in my office at this point.
I see. Well, would you light up this, please?
Yes, you may see the sun rise. I now know what Katie Couric's life was like, and I think I'll pass. I understand you all had a wonderful evening last night at Camilla's. David, I'm getting some feedback, I think, from my own voice coming back through the system, but maybe there's no alternative to that.
I'm going to see if I can fix that.
On this end, Lee, you sound fine. We sense the wisdom.
Okay, but I'm just, I get bored enough with hearing myself talk, much less hearing it back again. So, let me, first of all, say a word. I promised you to begin by telling you if there's any future to the professoriate, since that's what we've been working on here at our meeting here. And one of the very interesting features of the rather rapid change in the professoriate, and I probably shouldn't say this with all of the graduate students around, but as I think all of you have seen in your own setting, there is a very rapid shift from a full-time professoriate to more and more positions being defined as adjunct or as part-time and as non-tenure track. Now that may not have an impact on those of our graduates who are going into the K-12 system, because K-12 has not yet been hit by part-time and adjunct appointments. But the professoriate certainly has, and one of the things I'd like to discuss with you toward the end of my remarks is some of the real tensions that arise when you're trying to develop a program of professional preparation and trying to both design it and teach it with a teaching faculty that is largely part-time or adjunct. Or just as bad, a full-time faculty that behaves as if it were part-time or adjunct. But that's one of our dirty little secrets, so we'll hold off on that one for a moment. The notion of signature pedagogies began to develop in our work on the profession. I'm still getting feedback, folks, on whoever the technology person is. I'm still hearing echoes. I don't know if there's any way to deal with that. Okay. The notion of signature pedagogy was developed when we made the observation that whenever we site visited a professional preparation program, whether it was in the law or nursing or engineering. When we went from class to class during a particular segment of the program, there was a remarkable similarity, a remarkable congruence of teaching from class to class, and that the students were not having to adapt to dramatically different kinds of teaching or expectations as they moved from Professor X to Professor Y, or from the pediatric rotation to the internal medicine rotation, or from torts to contracts to criminal law in the law school. The other thing we saw was when we moved from program to program, there was remarkable similarity in the teaching that went on, whether you were at the University of New Mexico or the University of Dayton. And what struck us is that the fields had developed patterns of teaching that were, that's why we call them that, the signatures of the field. And the other characteristic of these pedagogies is they seem to be connected to an implicit theory in that field of what it meant to think or behave like a professional in the field. So if you ask law faculty to explain why it is that this case dialogue method was used in every one of what we call the doctrinal courses, they would explain, because we're trying to teach them how to think like a lawyer, and if we don't give them lots of practice in the same kind of analytical reasoning and dialogical exchange and debate and exploration of alternative interpretations again and again and again with different subject matter, they'll never learn to think like a lawyer. And you get similar kinds of responses from nursing faculty and from medical faculty as well. And so we began to explore what it was about each of those fields that led them to converge on a much more limited set of pedagogies. And our conclusion was that in many cases, this was not a matter of design. It was a matter of tradition that had developed over generations of teaching. But in many cases, it was remarkably adaptive and consistent or congruent with what really mattered to the faculty and to the profession. And so I guess what I've done, at least as a hypothesis, is to suggest that as fields mature, that kind of pedagogical convergence occurs, and it's one of the ways in which you find that you create a field, that people in a field that have been trained in different places tend to share a certain lexicon, a certain way of analyzing problems and dealing with them, and become more and more capable of learning from one another and from creating a professional community that has a certain coherence or cohesion. This is not to say that one starts from the very beginning to try to create a lockstep in which every program is a clone of every other program, but it does suggest that the utter kind of variation that most often characterizes our programs may have gone far too much in one direction, in the direction of local variation. So let me say a few things about these signature pedagogies. I'm in the process of writing a lot more about this stuff, and I've shared much more detail with this group in earlier meetings, which I don't think is appropriate now. And I think that, David, will help answer the question of whether you would expect the same pedagogies if you were preparing professional teacher educators as if you were preparing professional administrators. Because I think the answer is not likely, except to the extent that there was the same underlying challenge or responsibility that was shared by members of both professions. And just to anticipate one of my own thoughts, I would guess that there would be a high level of similarity around the challenges of instructional leadership and supervision. That there would be a fair amount of similarity, potentially, in the signature pedagogies of both ed leadership and teacher education around how do you learn to look at, think about, critique, analyze, help repair the quality of teaching and learning in inside and outside classrooms. How do you develop the capacities of teachers over the course of their careers? I could imagine that as a shared focus of the pedagogies for preparing both educational leaders and teacher educators. But let me just say a few things about these pedagogies. Signature pedagogies, as I said before, tend to be pervasive and persistent. What they don't do is give the students the sense that as they move from class to class, they're moving across totally independent, unrelated events, which I dare say is often the experience of being a graduate student in some of our current programs. They have a sense that they are moving from setting to setting in which the topics are changing, the problems are changing, but the rules of engagement and how it is that they're expected to think and behave are reasonably similar. So when we work with members of other professions, we use the following framework to try to look at these pedagogies. The first question we ask is, in your field, what does it mean to think like, let's say, a lawyer? Or think like a nurse? Or think like a rabbi? At first, except for the law, where they use this language all the time, that's seen as a very hard, strange question. And it takes a lot of discussion to get them to wrap their heads around that question. But I don't know if you've done some of this already in your small groups, but I think it's a real starting point for beginning to wipe the slate clean, back off, and begin to ask about our goals and our programs and what kinds of pedagogies would best fit our goals. And what's interesting is when you do this kind of analysis, you often find that the kind of teaching we do typically doesn't fit very well with the kind of thinking that we want our students to develop and turn into habits of mind, into really ways of engaging intellectually with the challenges of the profession. So in the case of thinking like a professional, let me give examples from some of our other fields. What are the core, if you will, texts of your field? Let's take text literally first. What are the sorts of things that a mature professional in your field encounters literally as pages of text, as reports, as evaluations, as personnel reviews, as well as metaphorically as texts. The behavioral texts of a teacher teaching, or of a crisis in the community, or of a forthcoming NCATE or TIAC review. And what kind of interpretive, critical reading of those texts does somebody need to learn to do? Now, in the law, it becomes clear what the range of texts that have to be read, interpreted, understood, analyzed are. In the clergy, it's pretty clear what those texts are. In medicine and nursing, somewhat less text-centric, but still you can ask the questions. What are the materials that regularly, repeatedly cross their desks that they have to learn to interpret, make sense of, and what kind of pedagogies are most likely to develop the skills, the habits of mind, the learning to read critically that they're going to need in their everyday work. That's one aspect of thinking like. Another is what kind of reasoning, problem solving, decision making do they regularly have to make? And how do you get practice in making these? To what extent are these decisions or dilemmas that require thinking through a whole set of trade-offs and figuring out how to make them in given situations? Here again, a lot of you are doing this already, but are you systematically developing pedagogies across courses that give students more and more practice in learning to think and reason in these ways? To what extent are the texts that they're thinking about and reasoning about critically, could they be represented by videotapes of teachers teaching, or of students learning, or of teachers or students talking about their work and what makes it hard or easy, and what does it take to learn to make sense out of those kinds of stimuli, if you will. And again, the assumption is that this is not easy to do, that a mere layperson couldn't do it, that a well-trained nurse could not look at the texts of teaching any more skillfully than a well-trained teacher, educator, or administrator could look at the texts of nursing. And so a lot of the signature pedagogies seem to develop around the thinking like, reasoning like, reading like roles that the professional plays. And again, this is a big chunk of what we do in our professional preparation programs. So if thinking like is one domain, there's another domain that is common to all the professions, and that's what does it mean to perform like a member of the profession? What does it mean to have to do the work of the profession? One hopes it's done in conjunction with thinking about it, but unlike the disciplines, we're often learning to think about it analytically and write about what you think is the goal of the profession. That's not the case in the professions we're talking about, because thought has to be connected to action. And so this leads to a concern for what are the core tasks of the field. And often if you're using a problem-based curriculum, for example, those problems, those sets of problems, grow out of some sort of formal or informal analysis of what the recurring tasks that have to be done in the field are, and a sense that students need practice in performing them, and then just as important, they need practice in learning to look at the consequences of action, evaluating those consequences, and redesigning or rethinking how they might perform the next time. And here again, that whole domain of performance, of thinking about tasks, is very important. And I should add that in both those areas, thinking like and performing like, we've got to be sure that we don't limit ourselves to just the status quo in the field. Can you see on the horizon dramatic changes in what it is that the people you're preparing are going to have to be thinking about or doing? And have you built into your program both, if you will, the analysis of the current tasks and anticipation, prediction of the future ones? And sometimes that's not just prediction. In many cases, and I know we do this in teacher education, we talk about what the teacher educators ought to be doing that they're not doing now. There's a kind of normative element to some of these sorts of tasks. The third element of the analysis in signature pedagogies, and this is the one that probably in most professions is ignored most frequently, or if not ignored, is marginalized, and that's what are the moral and ethical challenges of the profession? What are those situations in which what the professional is called upon to be is a moral agent? Sometimes a moral agent standing in opposition to other forces within the educational setting, whether it's the community's majority view or No Child Left Behind, or a school board that is asking for action that the moral commitments of the leader feel are running contrary to the best interests of the students or of the educational enterprise. And how to build the moral element in, and to build it in not the way they do, for example, in law schools, where what they've done is often just add a course on legal ethics, totally separated from the rest of the curriculum. But find a way to weave into course after course, field experience after field experience, a concern for and with the moral and ethical demands of being a professional. And as we've said in some of our earlier meetings, we really can't ignore the fact that even though the intellectual and practical aspects of doing the professional's work are what we typically give the most attention to, a professional can get away with, if you will, making errors of thought. A professional can be excused for making mistakes in practice. But what loses professionals the trust of those around them, and often their jobs, are errors of moral judgment and ethical comportment. And these have to be central to the pedagogies and shouldn't all be a matter of how do you make sure not to get caught or to stay just on the right side of the line. So in some fields, and again, let me use nursing as an example, or the clergy as an example, the ethical and moral is very, very central. And you see built into the pedagogies questions of, is this the right thing to do? Is this a fair way of behaving? Is the decision you're making congruent with conceptions of social justice, of equality of opportunity, of fairness in other ways? It's remarkable how long the periods are in many kinds of professional education where you either never hear this question, or as so often happens in law schools, when students raise that question in a course on contracts or torts, and the professor's response is, look, leave questions of justice for next year. Now we're talking about the law. And the great challenge of a lot of these pedagogies is to find ways, kinds of teaching, where in the same sort of pedagogy you afford the opportunity to address all three aspects of the profession: learning to think like, act like, and have the integrity appropriate to the professional in the same setting, so you don't separate them out. And frankly, that's one of the reasons, I think, why one of the kinds of pedagogies that we see as a signature in many professions are various forms of case method. Cases which are highly situated challenge people to think, to examine and propose actions, to consider the consequences of actions, and because they're situated, there's always a moral or ethical element sitting there somewhere. And cases therefore sit as a pedagogical device between theory and practice, and between the typical and the ideal or normative, or how might it be otherwise kind of perspective. And that's why I think in many fields, some sort of combination of case-based, problem-based pedagogy is often the signature. Now, in fields where the students are in the field while they're learning, and that's going to be characteristic of most of your professional practice stuff, then you get an interesting hybrid between those kinds of cases that are, if you will, in the literature. Cases that are either classic or arise in the literature or in the news or what have you, and become the curricular matter of the instruction. And cases that are brought by the students from the field and placed in the middle of the table for them to present and everybody else to discuss. And these are very powerful. And again, these can take different forms, but the use of field-based cases is one of the really powerful ways in which some of the signature pedagogies make connections between the classroom and the field, and integrate and lock these two together rather than treating the classroom pedagogies and the field pedagogies as if they're two separate worlds. And as we've said in some of our earlier conversations, that's going to be and is one of the most demanding challenges of the work that we do in professional practice pedagogies with predominantly part-time students who are out in the field already most of the time, which is transforming what could be the greatest handicap of the programs, which is the students aren't full-time, into their greatest virtue, namely that the students are in practice in their clinical labs, if you will, most of the time, and they have to learn through our pedagogies to exploit the opportunities to learn, analyze, reflect, and evaluate that they encounter in the field, bring them back to the classroom for collaborative analysis, bring literature to bear on it, etc., make it part of the program of the professional practice laboratory settings, and then take them out to the field for further action, analysis, and retesting. So the pervasiveness of this broad family of case methods is an interesting characteristic of the signature pedagogies. The other, and again I've mentioned this before, is some form of what in clinical fields is called rotations. And that is a real challenge in our professional practice in education areas, because our students are already in the field in a particular setting. And if that's the only source of their clinical experience, then there's a built-in limitation. And so in other fields, there is a self-conscious attempt to find ways for students to rotate across different settings of practice, even if one of them is much more intense than some of the others, just to ensure that you get some kind of variation, and students begin to respect and understand the fact that as contexts change, you have to learn to think somewhat differently, different performances are called for, different standards may be called for. Let me just mention one other aspect, and that is that there's no necessary expectation that the signature pedagogies remain the same in every phase of a program. On the other hand, it doesn't hurt to think in those terms. Let me give an example. Let's assume that you have a pretty clear idea of what one of your graduates should know, be able to do, and become as a human being by the end of the 3 or 4 years they're in your program. And you have a sense of this performatively. I would ask, in the all-important introduction to the field, the core curriculum of the beginning of programs, the introductory seminar, whatever you call that shared experience that all your students have at the beginning, to what extent does that first experience in your program already prefigure the capstone? To what extent are students already being introduced to the kind of interpretive, performative, and moral challenges right at the beginning that they're going to have to deal with when they're maturely at the end of their student experience? One of the fascinating things that's happened in a lot of the professions is that, in contrast to several generations ago, where the first courses in professional education looked much more like undergraduate courses or undergraduate lectures or undergraduate seminars than anything else, in fields like engineering and fields like the clinical fields, the first year, even the first semester, the students in the program, they are beginning to grapple with prototypes of the kinds of challenges that they're going to be learning to do more and more effectively later on. This is in stark contrast to what we so often do in doctoral education, which is use the first course as a way of giving every faculty member a chance to talk about their work for a week at a time, or something like that, or just do a broad survey of the whole field. It may be necessary to do that sort of thing at some point, but it's quite different than what we see increasingly in professional preparation, where the students revisit, it's a kind of a spiral curriculum in the profession, from the very beginning, some of these signature tasks, challenges, and problems. Similarly, when you talk about the core of the program, what I've called the labs of practice, the ways in which the students connect the outside and the inside of the program in the guts of the program, are they continuously getting the chance to practice and reflect on these fundamental ways of thinking, acting, and being? And of course, as the program unfolds, and we talked about this yesterday, how can we embed formal and informal kinds of assessment in those experiences? In architecture, which is a field that we didn't study during my time at Carnegie, but was the last field that Ernie Boyer studied before his death. In fact, the work was published after he died. Every student begins to develop a design portfolio their first week of studying architecture. And that portfolio follows them not only through the architecture program, but throughout their career. Many of you are in institutions, and many of you may be doing this, in which students create and maintain an electronic portfolio through the course of their professional preparation. My sense is there's almost no teacher ed program in the country anymore where those learning to teach don't have a portfolio that they maintain and develop to look at their work and display it. And one way of thinking about the circumstances under which students in a professional preparation program who are dispersed so much of the time, unlike our full-time doctoral students, may need to work with the faculty to design structured portfolios that become ways of capturing what they're confronting, what they're learning, and how they're learning to cope with it, that become forms of self-assessment as well as ways of communicating both among themselves and with us, the faculty, about their development. Another kind of big but promising way to deal with these questions of creating quite specific signature pedagogies. And I suppose one of my dreams would be that a decade from now, one would come into one of our professional practice programs and we would find that as a field, we've developed a set of pedagogies that are simply distinctive and instantly recognizable as that's the way educators are prepared for these different roles. And there would be materials of teaching that we would have developed and exchanged among ourselves. I'm hosting a meeting here in a few months of people from around the country that are developing libraries or galleries of multimedia records of teachers teaching and kids learning that can be used in our professional preparation programs to give students practice at looking at teaching, critiquing teaching. These are very hard to do. You can't just run in, do a videotape, and take it out. And in other fields, places have done this sort of work in local settings, but because they share a sense of what the rubrics of display are, of what it is you want to make sure to include in any record of teaching, let's say. I'm just using that as an example. What do you have to know about the context? What do you have to know about the kids? What do you have to know about what happened before the events that you're looking at on video or in written records? Because they're developing a shared sense of this, they can begin to exchange examples. They can begin to talk about, well, my students did this, how did your students respond? And it just changes both the quality of teaching, I think, and the quality of discourse in these fields. I can imagine within the community sitting in this room a time within the next year or two when you not only share some core forms of documentation and assessment, but you begin exchanging teaching materials, cases, video records, problem challenges, and then exchanging information and insights about how well they work, how they're used, and to what end. Which I guess leads me to my last observation, which is going back to the question of the part-timeness, not of students, but of faculty. I taught in a couple of representative universities for 35 years, and it's pretty clear, at least where I taught, and maybe I just taught in underdeveloped places, that the way we did doctoral education was we would get together and the faculty would be asked what they wanted to teach. We'd have some meetings that in general define the topics that every student had to go through, and then we pretty much operated pedagogically as independent contractors. I mean, I remember more often than I care to confront some of my advisees coming into my office and saying, you know, Lee, in the first 3 classes I've taken here at, and I won't mention the institution, in each class we read the same article that you wrote. It was interesting the first time, it was comfortable the second, but it was kind of a waste the third. It was very clear to the students that we didn't spend much time coordinating our teaching. One of the things that we have to confront, I think, in programs of professional practice is that we really can't get away with that kind of faculty behavior. That if we aspire to the characteristics of signature pedagogies that thread their way in a consistent, persistent, powerful form throughout our programs, if we take seriously the notion that our professional preparation students are going to undertake a kind of arc of development as growing professionals, these programs are going to have to be designed very, very carefully by faculty who continue to meet together, to give feedback to one another, and to be sure that the kind of teaching they're doing really is continuous, congruent, and reinforcing over the course of the program. And that means, I think, 2 things. One, as I've said, much more faculty coordination. But 2, it also means that those of you who are taking upon yourself the responsibility of leading the creation of these programs not only have to get the buy-in of your colleagues, you and we have to think about what sort of faculty development will need to happen for us to move from a rhetoric of professional practice pedagogies to a reality of professional practice pedagogies. And, we don't think a lot about professional development for ourselves. We think of ourselves providing it for somebody else. And yet, what we're calling for here is deans and program leaders and faculty to commit to learning to teach in new ways, to reviewing each other's teaching, scaffolding each other's work, supporting each other's teaching, maybe more team teaching as we learn to teach in these new ways. And I don't think we are prudent if we enter this new challenge that we're taking on without seriously recognizing that we all are going to have to learn to teach in new ways and to collaborate with one another in ways that we've just never had to do before. And if that's a challenge for a full-time faculty, then what is going to be the challenge in our programs if we have a fairly high proportion of part-time faculty? And in professional practice fields, we often have a lot of part-time faculty, not because we're trying to save money on benefits, which is the way the university does these things, I think, or to give fewer people tenure, but because we do want to incorporate people from the field part-time into the teaching faculty. Well, again, if we want the consistency and congruence of these signature pedagogies, we have to think about professional development for them as well. They can't simply pop in, talk about their day's work, and teach the clinical course and leave with no concern about how this coordinates with the other work in the curriculum. And so I hope over the coming sessions, that's another thing we'll give some attention to. David, I think I'm finished. The sun is rising out here in California, and let's see if we can have a little bit of conversation before I go home and go back to sleep.
What Lee, I could see we want to all thank you first for this. Now we have some questions and comments.
Hi, Lee. This is Myron Dembo. I can't wait to
Hi, Myron. You're talking again. I love it.
You're still there.
California is still there. My son, Danny, who lives in San Diego, evacuated with his whole family on Sunday, but thank God they moved back to their home intact yesterday morning.
Well, that's great.
So, but I think, as you all know, it has been a devastating time here in California, in the South, and it's going to take a while to recover.
Okay. Lee, I'm reminded of Piaget's statement when he said he traveled to America. It was an American question. And what was the American question? Well, he said, people would say, if we now understand how children develop, what can we do to make them develop faster?
Right, the acceleration question. Right.
Well, so I'm applying this to this problem on signature pedagogies. My question, I have a series of questions. One, if you don't have it, how do you get it? And if it doesn't, do you allow it to emerge like it has in other professions, or do you attempt to create it and move more rapidly? If it doesn't exist, is it really fruitful to begin our program development asking the question, what is our signature pedagogy? Because it may come later in the process rather than early in the process.
Lovely question, Myron, and a good challenge. I think the difference between what we're doing and Piaget's American question is that Piaget was dealing with forms of cognitive development that he was persuaded are inherently biological and natural and will occur quite independent of any adult or social intervention. That the organism is biologically programmed to move from pre-operational to concrete operational to formal operational thought. I have no reason to believe that either our pedagogies or the learning of our students are on that kind of biological developmental line. And so that aspect of acceleration is not one that worries me. But I think that the other aspect is, and that is, if we don't have them yet, is it an unnatural act to try to invent what other professions seem to have developed through tradition and trial and error over 100 years? And I guess I'd say we could do it that way. I'm a little impatient. I'd rather take less than 100 years. I'd also like to exploit what we've learned from some of the other professions. And so I think that because we can analyze the reason why some of these kinds of pedagogies have persisted and developed and become more and more central, I think it gives us a leg up on moving ahead and designing our own kinds of teaching. I don't see any virtue at this point in saying, well, let's just keep on doing what we're doing, and over time these things are likely to evolve. If we have a pretty good idea of what they might look like, let's go for it. But let's go for it with enough variation among our settings that we can learn from some of the differences, and enough commitment to documentation and evaluation that we can also learn from our mistakes and what have you. So I don't see it as quite parallel to Piaget. I think we're in the design business, not in the development business. And so I would opt for doing this more purposefully and intentionally. Was that responsive, Myron?
Yes, but what about the last part of the question? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. The last part of the question is that if we admit that we don't have it, to ask new programs to begin by identifying their signature pedagogy, is that a fruitful way to go when the pedagogy may evolve after these programs have been developed? Could it be a barrier to thinking rather than a facilitator in thinking about new programs?
Well, I'd like to think it's a facilitator, and for the following reason. First of all, in some of your programs, it's likely that you have courses or experiences that correspond to what I would call the criteria of signature pedagogy. You know, you're like that character in one of Moliere's plays that said, God, I've been speaking prose all my life and I didn't know it. That you've got some of these, but they're only isolated in one course, in one experience. And you talk to the students and they talk about what a powerful experience that is, but because of the isolation we have from one another on the faculty, we don't know much about what our colleagues are doing. So one possibility is that we already have the seeds of what could become signatures, and we don't even know it. The second is that we've never really thought about this sort of thing as collectively and intentionally as we might. And as long as we're developing new programs, what does it mean to develop a new program? Does it just mean you change your admission standards? Does it mean you reshuffle the courses on the deck of the Titanic, as it were? Does it mean business as usual and then a new capstone? Or does it mean you sit back and say, how might we do this teaching otherwise? And I don't think, Myron, that one has to set out to change everything all at once. That's probably too much. Pick your spots, pick a domain, pick an area, and try to move in this direction. I think there's something intermediate, if you will, between saying, let's just keep on doing business as usual, and saying we've got to change everything at once, and we've got to have it all ready by September. Let's look for a sweet spot. And if the different programs in this community of scholars and community of educational leaders that I'm looking at now choose different sweet spots, then as we come together, we have a chance of learning from each other's experiences in ways that will, I'll use the term, accelerate the development of our programs in some pretty powerful ways. So I'd opt for design, but with a certain kind of prudence and modesty, if you will, rather than a kind of instant revolution.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good morning, Lee. Can you hear me? This is Margaret Grogan from the University of Missouri.
Hi, Margaret. How are you?
Just fine, thank you. Lee, I wanted to connect what you talked about yesterday with what you're talking about today. I heard you talk yesterday about the value of diversity, but at the same time, the value of looking for some commonalities. What would you say in terms of signature pedagogy and commonalities? Are you trying to find a balance there between what you've just said, which is that each university might find a sweet spot to develop, which could really increase the diversity that we've been talking about, but are you asking us to look at something that might be in the end a commonality? And if you are, what would be the area you'd like us to look at?
Okay, I'm resisting only one thing, Margaret, and that is what I would like you to look at. It's part of my learning to think like somebody who's going to retire in the summer. I want to shift more of that responsibility to you. I can provide some ideas, but it's not what I would like you to do. It's what's going to be most fruitful for you. One way to think about the diversity would be to think about it structurally, if you will. That some of your programs begin by thinking really, really hard about a capstone set of experiences. How do we want all this stuff to come together in a set of experiences, exercises, or I'm not sure what to call it, the dissertation that we do in PhD programs, but signature performances, if you will, that capture the essence of what it means to be a professional in our field and could serve as that sort of culminating experience. That's a big challenge, how to think about that. The virtue of thinking about that first is that it helps you map back into, well, then what would we have to do before that so you had a coherent pathway to that end? But others of you might say, look, it's fine to start there, but we got to know how to start with the students the first day they're in. So we want to think about socializing the students into a community of professionals from the get-go and begin thinking about the core orientation experience. Others of you may be captured by the notion of what's the educational professional equivalent of a laboratory, a field station, whatever the work site, in effect, that sits between the field and the academy is. And so that's one way of distributing responsibility and getting variation. You decide on different starting points. Another way to get variation is that because of regional differences, local differences, the demands of the settings in which you're working, the strengths and weaknesses of your own faculty, the interests of your students. Different programs will have different conceptions and statements of their ideal end or ideal student. These have got to be respected. Even though I talk about all law schools teach students to think like a lawyer, rest assured, the students at the law school of the City University of New York in Queens, or of the University of the District of Columbia Law School in Washington, or the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, those students undergo a formation and a development of an identity as lawyers that are quite different from those that are prepared at the University of Michigan or the University of Texas in Austin or at Yale. And it's because there's a different set of values and priorities that drive those different programs. So on the one hand, the students all learn to do analytic reasoning and things like that, to think like lawyers in a very similar way. But the way the package comes together, the values, the priorities, the social dispositions can be very, very different. That's another kind of variation. And I can imagine over the coming years, as you continue to meet, people who have pursued one kind of ideal, encountering others will say, you know, that's a missing element in our program. We've done this part very well, but the part that deals with identity and with the integration of a professional role around the values of, say, social justice or community engagement have been sublimed, that there will be this core of ways of thinking and performing that will be shared among programs. But that's a hypothesis. I could be wrong, quite wrong.
Hi, Lee. Cheryl Shakespeare, Virginia Commonwealth.
Hi, Cheryl.
I'm trying to think of this as a profession, let's say in educational leadership. And in looking at the programs across the country, I find that a few have built into the doctorate their EDD in whatever form it is, sort of licensure, but most don't. So first people go and get certified and licensed as teachers, then they go get licensed as school administrators, then they enter a doctorate program in school administration, which is very different, it seems to me, than most other professions, in that you've gone through 2 professional programs before you get to the 3rd professional program. And I'm trying to think as a profession, what's the likelihood that we would develop the doctorate in educational administration as the degree that you also became licensed in, and which would then mean we turned out fewer school administrators, because it seems to me that the standards that we admit people into our licensure programs are a lot different than the standards we admit people into our doctorate programs, which would decrease our enrollments a lot, which might lead to better school administrators, since we produce about 10 students for every opening in this country. So I'm trying to think about, is there any likelihood that by working through these will actually affect a larger professional change in the field?
Boy, Cheryl, you've been thinking about that a lot harder than I have. You sound like you're way ahead of me. One of the things I did last week, no, I take it back, it was still this week, was spend a couple of days in a conference dealing with the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, which is now 20 years old. And we were dealing with it because my colleagues and I and my students developed the original prototypes and field tests for what became the assessments of the National Board. And when Gary Sykes and I wrote the original position paper which was an act of dreaming, describing what the national board might be, one of our throwaway lines was, wouldn't it be interesting if no one could even be a candidate for educational leadership who was not first a board-certified teacher? Because of the kind of experiences having to do with the systematic analysis of their own practice, of learning to work with other teachers to scaffold each other's development, etc., that was being called for by national board certification. That's an example, if that kind of fantasy were played out, of serial certification and licensure, if you will. A little bit like saying, first you're an accountant, then you're a CPA, and then I'm not sure what's beyond that. I think a convict in some cases. I think this is a matter of, this is going to happen, I suspect, state by state. Folks like you are going to help determine whether these things happen, but it would be very interesting. What would happen in some of your programs if you set as the entrance requirement for your intense program in educational leadership that you admit only people who have already achieved board certification as teachers? I mean, that's a hypothetical. But it would already suggest a certain focus on instruction, instructional leadership, the principal as the principal teacher, not as the manager, and it would begin to characterize a certain kind of program. I think that's really in your hands. It happens to be something that I find very attractive, but yes, it would. On the one hand, it would cut down the size of your classes. On the other hand, as of next week, there will be 63,000 board-certified teachers in America. And I'll bet most of them aren't in programs of educational leadership. And yet, they're all identified. You know where to go to recruit. So, it's a very provocative question. I bet this group will be an interesting group to deliberate about that over the coming months and years. Very, very interesting.
Lee, thank you very much for this time together. Can we all give him a hand, please? I hope you feel it was well worth getting out. This was very, very helpful this morning. We really appreciate it. Let's review our bidding quickly. We're going to take a break in just a minute. Recall that we're now going to